The bride's face didn't match her photograph. The farmer said it matched something better. Celia Dunmore pressed her gloved hand against the side of the stagecoach and watched the town of Powder Bend crawl into view through the dust-smeared window. It was not much of a town. A single street of warped storefronts, a water trough green with algae, and a general store with a sagging porch. She had traveled 1,100 miles from Baltimore for this, and the sight of it made her chest squeeze tight. She touched the left side of her face. The birthmark spread from her temple to just below her cheekbone, a deep port wine stain the color of crushed berries. She had worn her hair swept carefully over it for the photograph she had sent to Gideon Hale 3 months ago, and in the dim light of the photographer's studio, the blemish had been nearly invisible. She had not lied. Exactly. She had simply let the shadows do what shadows do, but shadows would not save her now. The coach lurched to a stop. The driver called out, "Powder Bend!" and tossed her trunk from the roof before she could even gather her skirts. She climbed down carefully, steadying herself on the iron step, and stood in the street with her carpet bag in one hand and her heart beating so fast she could feel it in her wrists. A man stood near the depot railing, tall, raw-boned, with sun-darkened skin and wheat-colored hair that needed cutting. He wore no hat, which struck her as odd for a farmer. His jaw was square, his eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow, and he held a folded letter in his right hand. Her letter, she realized, the one with the photograph tucked inside. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. Celia watched his expression shift. Not anger, not exactly. Something slower. Confusion folding into recognition, folding into something she could not name. He took 2 steps toward her, and then stopped, and she saw his gaze settle on the left side of her face. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice came out thinner than she wanted. "Miss Dunmore." A silence opened between them that felt wider than the street. She could hear the coach horses stamping behind her, and the creak of the driver climbing back to his seat. In a moment the stage would pull away, and she would be standing in this strange town with no ticket back and no money for one. "The photograph," he said quietly. "It didn't show." "No." She lifted her chin. "It didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, not revulsion, but a kind of careful weighing, as if he were measuring something she could not see. Then he folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket. "You hungry?" he asked. Yes." "Come on then. The wagon's around back." He did not offer his arm. He did not smile. But he picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing and carried it across the street to a weathered buckboard hitched to a pair of sorrel mares. And Celia followed him because there was nothing else to do. The ride to his farm took 40 minutes over a rutted track that wound through prairie grass as tall as the wagon wheels. Gideon Hale did not speak. He held the reins loosely in both hands and watched the road with the patient attention of a man accustomed to long silences. Celia sat beside him on the bench seat and studied the landscape. The enormous sky, the wind bending the grass in silver waves, the distant line of cottonwoods that marked a creek she could not yet see. The farm appeared gradually, first a windmill, its blades turning slowly against the sky, then a barn of unpainted wood, its doors standing open, then the house itself, small, square, built of sod and timber with a pitched roof and a porch that ran along the front. Smoke rose from the chimney, which surprised her. He lived alone, he had written. Who had set the fire? "I started the stove before I left," he said, as if reading her question. "Figured you'd want coffee after the ride." He carried her trunk inside. The house was clean but spare. A single room divided by a curtain, with a cook stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A shelf held 3 books, a tin of salt, and a photograph in a wooden frame that she recognized as her own. The one she had sent him, the one that lied. Celia stood in the middle of the room and waited for him to say what she knew he would say. That the arrangement was off, that she should have been honest, that he would put her on the next stage east and they would pretend the whole business had never happened. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee, set one on the table in front of her, and sat down across from her, with his hands wrapped around the other. "I'm not a man who cares much about photographs," he said. She blinked. "You sent for one." "My sister told me to. Said a man ought to know what his bride looks like before she shows up." He took a sip. "I wrote to you because of your letters, the way you described things, the way you thought about the world." He set down the cup. "That hasn't changed." Celia felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain, but the release of a pressure she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the warm tin cup, and for a moment she could not speak. "People stare," she said finally. "You should know that. Wherever I go, people stare. People in Powder Bend stare at everything. Last month they stared at Emmett Walsh's cow for 2 days because it wandered into the church during Sunday service." He looked at her evenly. "They'll find something else to stare at by Tuesday." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. Over the following days, Celia learned the shape of Gideon Hale's life. He rose before dawn, fed the chickens and the 2 mares, checked the wheat fields on foot, and returned for breakfast at 7. He ate the same thing every morning: biscuits, bacon, black coffee, and seemed mildly astonished when she made eggs with wild onions she had found growing near the creek. She learned other things too: that he talked to the mares in a low, steady voice while he brushed them, that he kept a leather-bound ledger on the shelf where he recorded rainfall, planting dates, and the price of wheat in careful block letters, that he sharpened his tools every Sunday evening with a whetstone that had belonged to his father, working the blade back and forth with the same patient rhythm he brought to everything else. He was not a warm man, not yet, but he was a thorough one, and she came to understand that his silence was not coldness, but a kind of restraint, the habit of a man who had lived alone so long that words had become expensive to him, each one weighed before it was spent. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he asked on the 3rd morning, looking at the plate as if it had appeared by magic. "My grandmother. She ran a boarding house in Baltimore. Must have been a good one. It burned down when I was 16. That's when I went into service." She did not elaborate. He did not ask. They were careful with each other. He slept in the barn without complaint, insisting the house was hers until she felt settled. He spoke to her in short, direct sentences, never touching on the birthmark, never avoiding it either. When she swept her hair across her face from habit, he said nothing. When she forgot and let it fall back, he said nothing about that either. He treated it the way he treated everything else about her, as a fact, not a problem. The town was harder. On her first visit to the general store, Mrs. Eubanks behind the counter stared openly, her mouth pulling into a thin line of distaste. The woman did not say anything cruel. She was too polite for that, but her silence was loud enough to fill the entire store. Celia bought flour, salt, and a tin of lard. Her hands did not shake. She had been stared at her entire life, and she had learned to carry it the way some women carry a heavy basket, with her spine straight and her chin up, and her eyes fixed on something beyond the person doing the staring. But when she climbed back into the wagon, Gideon was waiting. He had seen Mrs. Eubanks through the window. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine." He looked at her for a moment, then turned the mares toward home. 2 days later, Celia noticed that a new bolt of blue calico had appeared on the kitchen table. There was no note, no explanation. She found out later from the post rider that Gideon had ridden to the next town, 14 miles each way, to buy it from a different store. She made a dress from that calico. It was the first new dress she had owned in 4 years. Other small changes accumulated. She hung curtains in the window from a flour sack she had bleached and hemmed. She found a wild rose bush growing along the creek bank and transplanted a cutting to the front of the house, banking it with straw against the wind. She organized the root cellar, swept the barn, and whitewashed the inside of the chicken coop with a mixture of lime and water that she mixed in a tin pail. Each task was small, but together they added up to something larger, the slow, deliberate act of making a place her own. Gideon noticed. He did not comment, but she saw him pause sometimes in the doorway, looking at the curtains or the rose bush or the newly swept floor, with an expression of quiet surprise, as if the house he had built with his own hands had become, without his permission, something more than it had been. The wedding happened quietly on a Thursday afternoon in the front room of the house, with the circuit preacher performing the ceremony and the postwriter standing as witness. Gideon had asked her if she wanted to wait, and she had said no. She had waited long enough. For a home, for someone who looked at her face without flinching, for a life that did not require her to hide. That night, after the preacher and the postwriter had gone, they sat on the porch together and watched the sun go down over the wheat fields. The sky turned gold, then copper, then a deep and aching red that reminded her of the birthmark on her own face. And for the first time in her life, she did not mind the comparison. "Gideon," she said. Why did you really keep me? You could have sent me back. No one would have blamed you." He was quiet for a long time. The windmill creaked. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass. "When I was 12, he said, a hailstorm flattened my father's entire wheat crop in 20 minutes. Everything he'd worked for all season, gone. He stood in the field afterward and looked at what was left, just stalks beaten flat to the mud, and he said, 'The wheat that comes back from this will be the strongest wheat I ever grew.'" Gideon looked at her. "I figure it works the same with people." She reached over and took his hand. It was rough and calloused and warm, and he closed his fingers around hers without hesitation. The first real test came in September, when drought settled over the territory like a punishment. The creek dropped to a trickle. The wheat turned brittle and pale, and 3 farms to the north dried up completely, their families packing wagons and heading east. Gideon walked his fields every morning with his jaw set and his eyes narrow, measuring the damage in a silence that frightened her more than any words could have. Celia did what she could. She carried water from the creek in buckets, rationed their food stores, and planted a kitchen garden in the shade of the house where the soil stayed damp longest. She saved the dishwater and the wash water and poured it on the vegetable rows each evening, and when Gideon came in at sundown looking hollowed out and gray with dust, she fed him and sat with him, and did not ask questions he could not answer. One evening in late September, she found him sitting on the edge of the porch with his head in his hands. She sat down beside him and put her hand on his back, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "I might lose this place," he said. His voice was raw. "You might," she said, "but you won't lose it alone." She meant it. The next morning she was up before him, hauling water to the vegetable rows in the gray light before dawn. She walked the wheat fields herself, pulling the weakest stalks and piling them as mulch around the stronger ones, a trick her grandmother had used in the boarding house garden during dry summers in Baltimore. She bartered eggs for seed at the mercantile and planted late beans along the south wall of the house, where the reflected heat might give them an extra week of growing season. At night, she sat at the table with Gideon's ledger open in front of her, adding columns of figures by lamplight, calculating how many bushels they would need to make it through winter, and how many they could reasonably expect from what remained standing in the fields. He looked at her then, and she saw something in his face that she had never seen directed at her before. Not gratitude, not affection, but a kind of fierce, quiet recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. Not the birthmark, not the photograph, not the mail-order bride who had arrived under false pretenses. Just Celia, the woman who carried water in buckets and planted vegetables in the shade, and sat with him when the world was falling apart. "Your face," he said quietly. Her hand went up instinctively. "No," he said. He reached over and gently pulled her hand away. "I was going to say, it matches something better than any photograph. It matches the woman who's been keeping this farm alive while I was too proud to notice." The rains came in October, not a dramatic downpour, but a slow, steady soaking that lasted 3 days and left the creek running full and the wheat fields glistening. It was too late to save the full harvest, but enough of the crop survived to carry them through winter, and Gideon stood in the field on the morning the rain stopped, with his face turned up to the clearing sky and an expression she had never seen on him before, something like hope. By November, the farm had steadied. The wheat was cut and stored, the root cellar was full, and the kitchen garden had produced enough squash and potatoes to see them through to spring. Celia had patched the barn roof, mended the chicken coop, and taught herself to repair the windmill pump from a diagram she found in one of Gideon's 3 books. On a cold evening in late November, she was kneading bread when Gideon came in from the barn and set something on the table beside her. It was a small wooden frame, hand-carved, with a piece of glass fitted carefully into the front. Inside the frame was nothing. No photograph, no picture of any kind, just an empty space. "What is this?" she asked. "A frame," he said, "for a new photograph. When the circuit photographer comes through in spring, I want one of you, the real you. No shadows, no tricks, just your face." She looked at the empty frame, and then she looked at him, and then she set down the bread dough and wiped her hands on her apron and put her arms around him. He held her tightly, his chin resting on the top of her head, and outside the window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, soft and white and quiet, covering the prairie in a clean, unbroken sheet. In the spring, when the photographer came through Powder Bend on his annual circuit, Celia Hale sat for a portrait in the front room of the farmhouse, with the morning light falling full across her face. She did not turn her head. She did not sweep her hair forward. She looked directly into the camera with both sides of her face visible, the unmarked side and the birthmark, and she did not blink. Gideon stood behind the photographer with his arms folded across his chest, watching. When the photograph was developed and delivered 3 weeks later, he put it in the hand-carved frame and set it on the shelf beside the old one. "That's better," he said. And it was.